Picture the most photographed house in the world. 18 acres behind a black iron fence, 132 rooms, a doorknob polished every single day by someone whose name you will never learn. Now fill it with things that cannot be said out loud. A surgeon's bag carried up a service stairway at midnight, a syringe wrapped in a handkerchief, a wife standing between her husband's bedroom door and the entire United States government, and winning. A barrel of burning paper in a Manhattan backyard, tended by a dying man in a dressing gown. A locked closet in Ohio with 100 love letters nobody will be allowed to read for 90 years. That is the presidency. Not the marble version. The real one. A place where a man could shake 4,000 hands in an afternoon and go upstairs at night to a body that was quietly failing. A diagnosis no one would speak. A name he could not mention even in his sleep. A place where the most public life in America ran on private silence. Because here is the strange arithmetic of that office. The more visible the man, the deeper the hiding places had to be. The louder the crowds, the quieter the rooms upstairs. And some of those rooms stayed quiet for a very, very long time. Some of them stayed quiet until everyone involved was dead, and the doctors were dead, and the wives were dead, and the only witnesses left were paper and ash, and eventually blood itself, tested in a laboratory a century too late for anyone to be embarrassed. Tonight we're going into those rooms, 10 of them, 10 secrets that sitting presidents of the United States successfully hid from the country that elected them, ranked from number 10 to number 1 by 2 measures. How dark the secret was, and how completely it was buried. Every one of them real, every one of them anchored in dates and documents you could go and touch, most of them fully understood only after the man was in his grave. And wherever the documents stop and a question begins, I will say so, out loud, at the exact moment it matters. I will always tell you which is which. So, I make these history stories, and honestly, I have no clue whether anyone actually sleep to them, or whether you are all just quiet, strange people who happen to enjoy hearing about secret surgery performed on a moving yacht in the East River. Either way, subscribe if you want. Get comfortable. Dim whatever light is still on. Here we go. First, the rules of the list, because a countdown is only as honest as its rules. To make this list, a secret has to be real, meaning it survives in documents, in medical records, in letters, in sworn accounts, in laboratory results. No whispers, no theories, no midnight internet folklore. It has to have been actively concealed while the man held office, not merely unnoticed. And it has to have gone to the grave with him, meaning the full truth was not confirmed until after his death, in most cases decades after, in one case 172 years after. Where a piece of the story is a claim rather than a proven fact, I will tell you so, plainly, in one sentence, because the entire authority of a list like this rests on knowing the difference. And one more thing before we begin the descent. You will notice that almost none of these secrets are about money. The darkest things presidents hid were almost never in a ledger. They were in the body, and in the bed, and in the blood. A jaw, a heart, a mind, a woman, a child. The office demanded a healthy, upright, uncomplicated man. And so, again and again, a sick or grieving or divided man simply manufactured one. And the country shook hands with the manufactured man, and the real one stayed upstairs. The White House staff had a phrase for the upper floor, the private floor, the one the public never saw. They called it simply the residence. Keep that word in mind tonight. Every secret on this list lived in some version of the residence, some sealed upper floor of a public life, and one honest word about how we will walk through it. The rooms are real, the dates are real, the documents are real, and so are the presidents. But the eyes I will lend you in each room, the groom, the maid, the technician, the deckhand, are borrowed, composites stitched, from the kinds of people who truly stood in those doorways, because the archives rarely wrote down where the servant stood, and a listener needs somewhere to stand. The rooms are history. The eyes are only a place to watch it from. We're going up the stairs now. Number 10. You're an Army Signal Corps technician assigned to the White House in the spring of 1964, and you have just been handed a work order that does not exist. It is not written down. Work orders in this building are always written down, logged, initialed, filed. That is the whole religion of the Signal Corps, and so a spoken one delivered quietly by a warrant officer who watches your face while he says it, tells you everything by telling you nothing. One of the machines in the little room off the President's Secretary's office is dropping its volume. You will fix it. You will fix it during the lunch hour when the outer office is thin, and you will not discuss the machine, the room, the wiring, or the work, not with the other technicians, not with your own officers, not with anyone in a uniform or a suit, for as long as you live. He does not say that last part. He does not need to. You are 23 years old, and you carry your tool bag down the corridor past the portraits with your eyes forward, and the thing you know, which almost no one in the United States knows, rides along inside you like a swallowed stone. Here is what you know. The telephones of the President of the United States are wired for sound, not tapped by an enemy, wired by the government's own hands, your hands among them, on the President's own instruction. In the desks and cabinets of the secretaries who sit outside the Oval Office there are dictaphone machines, squat grey boxes warm to the touch, and when the President is on certain calls, a secretary slips a thin plastic belt onto a spindle, and a stylus settles into its groove and the belt turns, and the voice of whoever is speaking to Lyndon Baines Johnson, a senator, a governor, a cabinet officer, an old mentor, a widow, goes into the wax with every hesitation and every breath. The men on the other end of the line do not know. That is the entire point of the system. It only works if they do not know. The little room smells of warm dust and solder and the faint sweetness of new cable, and you work fast because the machine must be back under its grey cover before the outer office fills again. You replace the worn stylus, check the drive wheel, thread a test belt, and you are careful, the way you were trained to be careful, to keep your ears on the machine and off the words, because the words are above your clearance and beyond your pay, and none of your business forever. Level, hum, flutter. Once, for perhaps 4 seconds while you calibrate, a voice comes up in the earpiece, unmistakable, that drawling, pressing, enormous Texas voice, saying something low and kind to someone, and you pull the plug as if it had burned you. You log nothing. You initial nothing. You pack your bag and nod to the secretary, and she nods back, and neither of you was ever in that room. You will be in it, in exactly this way. Many more times before your tour ends. Now step back from the doorway, and let me tell you what the record shows, because every piece of this one is documented, dated, and sitting today on open shelves. From his first days in office in the stunned weeks after Dallas in November 1963, and continuing through the whole of his presidency, Lyndon Johnson secretly recorded his own telephone calls and portions of his own meetings on machines installed and maintained by military signal men, and operated by his own secretaries. Not a handful of calls, roughly 800 hours. The calls of the assassination winter, when a shaken new president assembled a government by telephone. The calls of the Gulf of Tonkin summer, the civil rights bills, the landslide of 1964, the riots, the war as it turned and swallowed him, all of it going onto belts and reels, thousands of conversations, while the people on the line spoke freely to a friend and had, without knowing it, an audience of one machine. The country did not know. The Congress did not know. The Cabinet, with the rarest exceptions, did not know. Most of the White House staff walk past those desks every working day for 5 years and did not know. And Johnson had not invented this. That is part of this secret, strange darkness, that it was an inheritance, a private tradition of the office, handed down in silence, and each man who received it kept it as carefully as the man before. The first hidden microphone in the Oval Office was Franklin Roosevelt's. In the autumn of 1940, an experimental recording machine was installed in a room beneath the president's office, its microphone concealed in the lamp on his desk, and for a few months it caught press conferences and stray fragments of private talk, and then it was abandoned, and the recording sat unknown in the dark for 38 years, until a historian named Robert Butow came upon them in 1978 and told an astonished country that it could listen to Franklin Roosevelt thinking out loud in 1940. 38 years and not a whisper. Then, in the summer of 1962, John Kennedy had the Secret Service wire the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room for sound, microphones in the desk and the fittings, tape reels turning in the basement, and the existence of that system was revealed only in July 1973, when its owner had been dead for almost 10 years. 3 presidents in a row, the most private room in the Republic quietly listening to itself, and the room never told. But Johnson used the inheritance on a different scale and with a different hunger, and that is why the machine, and not the men who wired the room before him, stands at number 10. For Roosevelt it was an experiment. For Kennedy it was an instrument, switched on selectively. For Johnson it was very nearly a reflex, because he was a man who governed by telephone the way other men govern by memo. 40 and 50 and 70 calls a day. Flattering, bullying, bargaining, mourning, counting votes at midnight. And the machine drank all of it. Senators told that telephone things. Senators tell no one. Grieving men wept into it. Old mentors gave him confidences, and the confidence had a stylus riding through it. Whether he kept the tapes as history, as a shield, or as ammunition, is a question the record cannot settle, and I will tell you plainly that it cannot. What the record settles is that he kept them, hid them, and never once in 5 years of that intimate voice on the line told the country the machine existed. And then he took the whole archive to the grave, by instruction. When he left office in January 1969, the belts and tapes and transcripts did not go to a shredder and did not go into any open archive. They went into the keeping of Mildred Stegall, the quiet, endlessly loyal aide who had guarded his most sensitive files for years, locked boxes, short lists, and from Texas came the instruction that sealed them. The recordings were to stay closed for 50 years after his death. 50 years. He flew home to the ranch on the Pedernales at 60, grew his white hair long, tended his cattle, took up again the cigarettes his doctors had taken away, and on the 22nd of January 1973, alone in his bedroom in the early afternoon, his damaged heart seized. and he reached for the instrument he had trusted his whole life, the telephone, and called for help. And by the time the agents reached the room, he was gone at 64. Under his own arithmetic, the voices in the boxes were to sleep until the year 2023. Every man on those tapes would be dead by then. Every secretary who had threaded a belt would be dead. You, technician, with your tool bag and your swallowed stone, would in all likelihood be dead. The machine was meant to outlive every ear it had ever borrowed. The seal cracked in 2 stages, and the first crack came almost at once, from the strangest direction, which is how seals usually crack. 6 months after his funeral, in July 1973, a former White House aide named Alexander Butterfield, answering a routine question before the Senate Watergate Committee, revealed that Richard Nixon taped his own offices, and the reeling country then learned within days what a very small circle had always known, that Kennedy had taped before him, and Johnson had taped before him, that the practice drowning one president had a quiet pedigree behind it. The existence of Johnson's system was public at last. The contents were not. The boxes in Austin kept their 50-year instruction, and the world moved on, and for 20 more years the voices lay in the dark. Then, in 1993, 20 years after his death and 30 years ahead of his own schedule, the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library began, carefully, chronologically, to open the boxes, the first releases forced by a new federal law that pried loose everything touching the Kennedy assassination, and after that, reel by reel, year by year, the rest. Historians sat down with headphones in a reading room in Austin and heard what no one outside that small circle had ever heard. Johnson roar in real time, consoling widows, twisting arms, counting his votes, and, most startling of all, agonizing over Vietnam years before he ever admitted doubt in public, confessing down the wire in 1964, in a recorded voice thick with dread, that he did not believe the war could be won and could not see a way out of it. The tapes rewrote him. The man history had filed away as the war's stubborn author turned out to have narrated his own tragedy into a hidden machine, call by call, and then sealed the evidence and died. It is the only secret on this list made entirely of the man's own voice, and he is the only man on this list who arranged deliberately for the truth to come out on the single condition that he would never have to be alive when it did. Come back one more time, technician, because your coda is the gentlest one tonight. In July 1973, long out of the army, you will hear the word Watergate and the word tapes in the same broadcast, and then the older names behind them, Kennedy, Johnson, and you will stand very still in your kitchen with a coffee cup you forget to drink. And decades later, an old man, you will hear on the radio a voice you once pulled out of your own earpiece after 4 seconds, that drawling, pressing, enormous voice, playing freely now on the public air, released by the library with finding aids and catalogue numbers, and you will understand that the stone you swallowed in 1964 has simply dissolved. You never told anyone. You never needed to. The machine told everyone, eventually, exactly as its owner planned. That is number 10, and it is the gentlest thing on this list. A secret that was in the end only a voice waiting out its own permission to speak. From here, the water gets deeper. Number 9. You are a stable groom at the Hermitage, 12 miles east of Nashville, Tennessee, on the night of December 22nd, 1828, and the house is making a sound you have never heard a house make. Not weeping exactly. Something lower. Doors opening and closing far too gently, the way people handle doors when a body's in the house. You were bedding down the horses when the kitchen girl came running across the frozen yard without a shawl, and now you stand in the cold breezeway holding a lamp you've forgotten you are holding, and the oil smoke stings your eyes, and upstairs Rachel Jackson is dead. She died a few minutes ago in the evening of her failing heart, at 61 years old, 10 days after the electors made her husband's victory certain. He won the presidency in the counting that December. She was sewing and packing for Washington. She had heard by then every word the opposition papers had printed about her during the campaign, the words her family tried to keep from her, and one account says she was found crouched and sobbing after overhearing 2 women in Nashville repeat them: adulteress, bigamist, the general's borrowed wife. And now the general, the president-elect of the United States, is upstairs beside her body, and he will stay beside it nearly all night. And no man on this farm, no man in this state, would dare go up those stairs to move him. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, 10,000 people stand in the mud and winter rain of the garden, while she is buried in the white dress she had bought for the inauguration balls. You're at the back, near the fence, hat crushed in your hands, and you hear him. Everyone hears him. Andrew Jackson, 61 years old, hero of New Orleans, duelist, the most dangerous man in America, stands over the grave and says, in a voice like a blade being drawn slowly, that in the presence of this dear saint he can and does forgive all his enemies. And then the pause, and then the rest of it. But those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy. You're a groom. You know the sound a man makes when he means a thing entirely. He means it entirely. He will go to Washington alone, wearing black, and he will wear black for her for the remaining 17 years of his life. Now let me tell you what the slander actually was, and why it belongs on this list, because I owe you an honest boundary before we go a step further. The scandal itself was never a secret. It was as public as anything could be in 1828, printed, pamphleted, read aloud in taverns from Maine to the Mississippi, and Rachel herself heard it. What stayed buried, and stays buried in the most literal sense of anything on this list, is what actually happened in 1791, because no record of any ceremony from that year has ever been found, and Jackson died without ever resolving the question, and historians cannot resolve it now. The scandal was built on that real secret, and the version of events Jackson defended with pistols and fury, and in one case with a bullet he carried next to his heart for the rest of his life, was a story. And the truth beneath the story is the thing he took to his grave. The documented facts run like this. Rachel Donaldson married a Kentucky man named Louis Robards around 1785, and the marriage curdled, and by 1790 she was back in her mother's household near Nashville, where a young boarding lawyer named Andrew Jackson was renting a cabin. In December 1790, the Virginia legislature passed an enabling act, a piece of paper that did not divorce the couple. It merely gave Robards permission to sue for divorce in a court. That distinction, one sheet of paper's worth of distinction, is the whole tragedy. The story Jackson told forever after was that he and Rachel heard the divorce was final, believed it in good faith, travelled down to Spanish Natchez on the Mississippi, and were married there in 1791, innocent as morning. Then, the story goes, they discovered to their horror that Robards had only afterward obtained his actual divorce, granted by a Kentucky court on September 27th, 1793, on the grounds that his wife had deserted him and was living in adultery with another man. So they quietly married again, correctly this time, in Nashville on January 17th, 1794, and the license from that second ceremony still exists, and you can look at it. Here is what does not exist. Any record of the first marriage, not a license, not a register line, not a minister's name, not a witness's sworn account of the ceremony itself. Nothing has ever been found in Natchez or anywhere else, and researchers have looked for 2 centuries. And there is a further quiet problem, which is that Natchez in 1791 was Spanish territory, Catholic territory, where 2 Protestant strangers could not easily have been legally married at all. So the historians who know this material best, the ones who spent their lives in Jackson's papers, concluded that the most probable truth is the simplest one, that in 1791 Andrew Jackson and Rachel Robards, she still legally another man's wife, began living as husband and wife without any ceremony, openly, in front of the small frontier world that knew exactly what it was seeing, and that the good faith mistake, the confusion about the divorce, the innocent Natchez wedding, was a protective story assembled afterward, polished over decades, and defended unto death. I want to be honest with you the way this list has to be honest. That conclusion is an inference, powerful but unproven. What happened at Natchez in 1791, a ceremony, an understanding, or nothing at all, has never been documented, and at this distance it never will be. And when I say Jackson defended the story unto death, I need you to understand what that meant in his world, because it did not mean stern letters. In 1806, a Nashville man named Charles Dickinson let the matter of Rachel's honour into a quarrel that began over a horse racing bet, and Jackson called him out, and on the 30th of May they stood at 8 paces in a Kentucky clearing. Dickinson, reputed the finest shot in Tennessee, fired first and put a ball into Jackson's chest, where it shattered ribs and lodged so close to his heart that no surgeon would ever dare remove it. Jackson did not fall. He stood there with blood filling his boot, levelled his pistol with the deliberateness of a man doing arithmetic, and killed him. He carried that bullet in his body for 39 years, an ache in wet weather, a cough with blood in it, a permanent physical instalment paid on the secret. That is what the story cost to maintain, not embarrassment. Lead. The campaign of 1828 was the final assault on it, and it remains one of the filthiest elections in American history. Pro-Adams pamphlets and papers, led by a Cincinnati editor named Charles Hammond, put the question in print for every literate household in the Republic. Ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband be placed in the highest offices of this free and Christian land? Jackson's people fought back with affidavits, with a committee of Nashville worthies assembled in 1827 to certify the innocent version, with the whole machinery of frontier honour. He won the election in a landslide, and weeks after the victory was certain, Rachel's heart stopped, and Andrew Jackson decided, with the granite certainty of a man who needed it to be true, that the slanderers had killed her. That belief he carried into the White House like a loaded weapon. It shaped his presidency in ways historians still trace, most famously in 1829 and 1830, when Washington society snubbed the young wife of his Secretary of War over her own supposed impurity, and Jackson, seeing Rachel crucified all over again, went to war for Margaret Eaton against his entire cabinet, and broke that cabinet apart rather than let the respectable women of the capital do to another woman what he believed they had done to his wife. He lived 17 more years, and the story never wavered by a syllable. He died at the Hermitage on the 8th of June, 1845 in the evening, telling the weeping enslaved household gathered at his bed that he hoped to meet them all in heaven, a sentence whose own darkness he did not hear. He was buried beside Rachel in the garden, next to the tomb he had visited every evening he was home for 17 years. On her monument he had ordered carved that a being so gentle and so virtuous slander might wound but could not dishonour, and in his room her miniature portrait, which he looked at every night, and by his bed her Bible, and in his chest, close by his heart, Charles Dickinson's bullet, the oldest receipt for The Secret. So there it lies, number 9. Not the affair itself, which the whole frontier saw, and the whole country eventually read about. The secret was the true shape of the beginning, the months and years when the story and the fact came apart, the thing only 2 people ever knew for certain. One of them was buried in the garden dress in 1828. The other one guarded it with pistols, with rage, with grief, with 17 years of black mourning clothes, and carried it under the slandered stone in the garden where it remains. The record shows a license from 1794, and before it, silence. He made sure of the silence. Number 8. You're a junior clerk in Joshua Speed's General Store on the west side of the public square in Springfield, Illinois, in the 3rd week of January, 1841, and you have been given a strange instruction. You're not to speak of who is upstairs. Upstairs, above the shelves of calico and salt fish and harness leather, is the big shared room where the young men of the store sleep, and in that room, in the grey light that comes through the frost-furred window, a man is lying with his face to the wall, and he's been lying there, on and off, for the better part of 3 weeks. He is 31 years old, 6 feet 4 inches of Kentucky-born lawyer and state legislator, ordinarily the funniest man in Sangamon County, the one they crowd around at the stove for stories. His name is Abraham Lincoln. And the other instruction, the one nobody wrote down but everybody in the household understands, is about the razors. The razors are kept downstairs now. Knives too, according to what neighbours and friends would recall for the rest of their lives. Not because anyone said the word aloud, because his friends looked at him and quietly moved the blades. You bring up broth he does not eat, and the room smells of cold ash and unwashed wool, and the tallow smoke of a candle burned too low, and the man who can make a courtroom weep with laughter says almost nothing for days at a stretch, and what he does say frightens you more than silence would. The date people in this town will whisper about for years is the 1st of January 1841, the day his engagement to Mary Todd was broken off, the day he himself later called, in a letter that survives, the fatal 1st of January. Within days he was too broken to appear in the legislature except in flashes. His friends genuinely feared for his life, and said so in letters that still exist. And on January 23rd he sat down and wrote to his law partner John Stewart in Washington, a passage that has survived, ink on paper, in his own hand, and I will give it to you exactly because no paraphrase should touch it. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. And then the practical line, the one that shows you how close the water was. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. Let me be careful here, the way this subject deserves. I am not going to hand a modern diagnosis backward through 180 years to a man who cannot consent to it. What I am giving you is what the record documents, and the record is thick. The people of New Salem remembered that after the death of Anne Rutledge in August 1835, the young Lincoln fell into a despair so visible and so alarming that neighbours took turns keeping him company in the worst weeks, and those recollections were gathered decades later, second hand. So hold them a shade more loosely than the 1841 letters, which are first hand and beyond dispute. His law partner of many years, William Herndon, wrote that his melancholy dripped from him as he walked. Friends and colleagues used the same word for decades. Melancholy, the era's word, a word that covered everything from sadness to the abyss. The condition, whatever name you give it, never fully left him. It was managed, fenced, worked around, hidden in plain sight behind the jokes, which more than one contemporary understood were not the opposite of the sadness, but the rope he had braided to climb out of it. He told friends in remarks they recorded that he laughed because he must not cry. Now move forward 21 years to the room where the hiding became presidential. It is the 20th of February 1862, a Thursday evening in a White House lit against the winter dark, and in a bedroom on the second floor, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln, the gentle one, the one everyone said was most like his father, has just died of typhoid fever, very probably carried in the contaminated water the mansion drew from the river. The president comes out of the room and says to his secretary, in words the secretary preserved, "My boy is gone. He is actually gone." And then he goes into his office and weeps in a way the household staff never forgot. In the weeks after, by the accounts of those around him, he shut himself away to grieve on more than one occasion, and the household believed he returned more than once to look at his son's face where the body lay. The country was 11 months into the bloodiest war it would ever fight. The casualty list from Fort Donelson ran in the same newspapers as Willie's funeral notice. And the President of the United States conducted that war every day, with the thing his era called melancholy sitting in the chair beside him, and the public was permitted to see a tired man, a sad-eyed man, a man of sorrows even, but never, not once, the full weight. Not the 1841 room above the store, not the moved razors, not the letter that said I awfully forebode, and here is why this is a secret and not merely a sorrow, and let me draw the boundary of this one honestly, because it is shaped differently from the others. It was never hidden from Springfield. His neighbours saw the winter of 1841 with their own eyes, sat with him through it, and remembered it aloud for the rest of their lives. And the documentation is exactly that. His own letters of January 1841, first hand and beyond dispute, and the recollections of Joshua Speed and William Herndon set down later and held accordingly. What was hidden, and hidden deliberately, was the severity. And it was hidden from the only audiences that could destroy him, the office, the electorate, and the marble version of himself that history was already carving. In Lincoln's America, a documented episode of what his neighbours frankly called derangement was politically fatal, permanently disqualifying, proof of an unsound constitution. Men were institutionalized on far less. His friends knew the stakes and closed ranks for the rest of their lives. He knew the stakes and built, on top of that broken January, a public self so sturdy, so deliberately common, so armoured in anecdote, that it carried him through the great elections and a civil war, and the millions of his countrymen who never met him died believing the armour was the man. The historians who assembled the record later, from the letters and the courthouse memories and Herndon's interviews, converge on one point. This item is not a hidden illness with the secret name, and I will not pretend it is one. It is the distance between the man his friends kept alive and the man his country was shown, and the size of that distance was concealed successfully for his entire public life. What the nights actually cost him in that upstairs room in 1841 and in the White House in 1862, and in all the unrecorded rooms between, went with him on the 15th of April, 1865, when he died at 7:22 in the morning in a boarding house bedroom too short for his body, across the street from Ford's Theatre. One more image, and then we will let him rest, because he has earned rest more than any man on this list. His friends remembered him saying, back in the terrible winter, why he had not let himself go under. It was recorded later, so take the phrasing as remembered rather than transcribed, but the substance is this. He said he had done nothing yet to make any human being remember that he had lived. That was the bargain he made with the darkness at 31. Upstairs over the dry goods. Stay alive and become worth remembering. You know how the bargain came out. The room above the store kept its secret. The razors went back on the shelf, and the most miserable man living wrote the second inaugural. He never told the country what it had cost. He just paid it, quietly, in the dark, with the blinds drawn, and gave the receipts to no one. Number 7. You are a housemaid at Friendship, the McLean estate on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, in the last days of August 1923, and your job tonight is carrying paper to a fire. The President of the United States has been dead for 3 weeks. You were in the kitchen when the news came from San Francisco on the 2nd of August. Warren Harding, dead in his hotel suite at the Palace at 7:35 in the evening, and the whole country went into black crepe, and the funeral train came east through crowds that stood along the tracks at midnight singing his favourite hymns. Now his widow is a house guest upstairs, because Florence Harding, moved out of the White House by custom, has come to stay with her friend Evelyn Walsh McLean, the mining heiress who owns the Hope Diamond and this estate. And what the widow of the president is doing in the last week of August 1923 is burning her husband. Not his body, his paper, which for a president is nearly the same thing. Wooden file boxes and cases have been coming to the fire evening after evening, and Mrs. Harding sits in a straight chair near the flames, a woman of 63 with a jaw like a closed purse and her ankles neatly crossed, and she reads. That is the part you will remember when you are old. She does not simply dump the boxes. She reads each letter first, quickly, like a customs inspector, and then most of them go in, and the fire breathes out a soft heat against your face, and fragments of blackened paper rise on the chimney draught, glowing at the edges, correspondence becoming weather. Some few papers she sets aside in a case at her feet. You carry and you feed the fire when she nods, and you do not read, because her eyes come up whenever your hands slow down. She had begun the work at the White House itself in the days after the funeral. The staff talk says, and she will state plainly to those close to her that she is protecting his memory. When she is finished, a large portion of the documentary life of the 29th President of the United States has ceased to exist. She dies 15 months after her husband, in November 1924, believing the work complete. It was not complete, and what survived, and when it surfaced, is why Warren Harding is standing here at number 7. Start with what the burning was guarding. Harding was, by the cheerful consensus of nearly everyone who knew him, a warm, weak, handsome man promoted beyond his depth, and he knew it, and said so privately in remarks his contemporaries preserved. But the secrets were specific. For roughly 15 years, beginning around 1905 back in Marion, Ohio, Harding carried on a love affair with Carrie Fulton Phillips, the wife of his good friend Jim Phillips, who kept the dry goods store. It ran through his rise through the Senate years up to the edge of the presidency, and it is not a rumor because he wrote to her. He wrote to her constantly, hugely, recklessly, letters of 10, 20, 30 pages in his own hand, and she kept them, nearly 100 of them. When the affair soured, and Carrie, who had lived in Berlin and loved Germany, bitterly opposed his pro-war Senate votes, the letters became a loaded gun pointed at his career, and in 1920 the men around the Republican nominee dealt with the problem directly. The Phillips family departed on a long, comfortable journey abroad, and the quiet arrangements surrounding that departure remain one of the murkier documented episodes of the campaign. Harding won the presidency that November in a landslide with the letters still sitting in a closet in Marion. Now watch how long paper can wait. Carrie Phillips died in 1960, a solitary old woman. Not long after, in Marion, the letters were found, still boxed. The Harding family went to court to stop their publication, and the settlement sealed them in the Library of Congress under a closure running 50 years. Think about that sentence. Through the moon landings, through Watergate, through the fall of the very Berlin Carrie had once loved, those letters sat in a locked collection with a date on them like a bomb with a very patient fuse. The closure expired, and on the 29th of July 2014, 91 years after the fires at Friendship, the Library of Congress opened the boxes and the world finally read the president in his own hand, love-drunk, code names and all, pouring himself out on official stationery to another man's wife. Florence had burned everything she could reach. She could not reach Marion. And then there is the second woman, and the child, and here the story stops being merely embarrassing and becomes something colder, because a human being spent her whole life inside this secret. Nan Britton was a Marion girl, 31 years younger than Harding, infatuated with him since her school days, and by her detailed account the affair began in 1917 and continued into the presidency itself, including, she wrote, meetings in a small anteroom closet adjoining the presidential offices. On the 22nd of October, 1919, while Harding served in the Senate, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Ann. Harding paid support quietly through intermediaries, by her account, but he never once saw the child. And then he died, and the money stopped, and the family dismissed Nan outright. So in 1927 she did something no one had ever done to a dead president. She published a book, The President's Daughter, naming him as the father of her child, and respectable America destroyed her for it. Booksellers hid it under counters, ministers denounced her, and the Harding family and its defenders dismissed her politely and permanently as a fantasist, and that dismissal held for the better part of a century, while Elizabeth Ann grew up, married, raised sons, grew old, and died in 2005, still officially nobody's daughter. Science has no politeness. In 2015, descendants of Nan Britton and descendants of the Harding family submitted DNA to a genealogical testing service, and in August of that year the result was announced and reported across the world. Warren Harding was Elizabeth Ann's father. 92 years after his death, 88 years after a mocked woman wrote the truth in a book, the fantasist was vindicated in a laboratory. Too late for her, too late for her daughter, too late for everyone except the record, which is the only thing in this story that never dies. I owe you one framing note, because accuracy is the whole authority here. The scandals most people attach to Harding, Teapot Dome, the oil leases, his Interior Secretary Albert Fall taking bribes and eventually becoming the first former cabinet officer in American history to go to prison for a crime in office. Those were crimes of the men around him, and the investigations broke open after his death, and no evidence ever showed that Harding profited. What Harding himself took to the grave was not the oil. It was the women, the child he never looked at, and the knowledge, which he confessed in documented private remarks, that the office was beyond him. "I have no trouble with my enemies," he told one confidant, in words that were preserved. "It is my friends that keep me walking the floor nights." The fires at Friendship burned for many evenings, and the maid carried the boxes, and the widow read each page before giving it to the flames. It was one of the most thorough concealments ever attempted on behalf of an American president, and it failed by exactly 2 archives, a closet in Marion and a woman's stubborn memory, and the truth waited in the first one for 91 years, and in the blood for 92. Paper burns, blood keeps the ledger. Number 6. You are a manservant in the brownstone at 123 Lexington Avenue in New York City on the 16th of November, 1886, and the master of the house has asked you to bring up the barrels. Big ones, garbage barrels. 3 of them hauled into the yard behind the house in the grey chill of a November afternoon, and then the carrying begins. Down the stairs, armload after armload, letters tied in ribbon, ledgers, bundled correspondence with the seals of departments and legations, the accumulated paper of a public life, 40 years of it, and at the top of the stairs, supervising in a dressing gown because he can no longer reliably stand for long, is a heavy, grey-faced gentleman with magnificent side whiskers and the manners of a duke, and he is watching his own history go down to the yard. His name is Chester Alan Arthur. 20 months ago he was President of the United States. Tomorrow morning, though neither of you can know the hour, a blood vessel will give way in his brain. 2 mornings from now he will be dead. You are the one with the matches. That is the part you never managed to forget in all the years after, when his face is on no coin and no schoolchild can name him. You stand in the cold yard as the light goes copper and then blue, and you burn the papers of a President of the United States at his own instruction, 3 barrels of them, and the fire keeps trying to die because paper in bulk smothers its own flame, so you turn it with an iron rod, and the pages open as they burn, and you're an honest man, so you try not to read. But a burning page always shows you one line as it curls, and the lines fly up glowing and vanish over the fence toward 28th Street. The neighbours think someone is burning leaves. What is actually burning is the evidence of a whole era, the private record of the machine politics of New York, the letters of the Custom House years, the accounts that historians will mourn for the next century and a half. He watches for a while from the window. Then the curtain falls back, and there is only you and the rod and the copper light. Now let me tell you why a dying man spent one of his last afternoons on earth destroying his own archive. Because the fire in the yard is only the second secret. The first secret had been running for 4 years, and it was in his blood. Chester Arthur was never supposed to be president, and no one knew that better than he did. He was the elegant creature of the New York machine, Roscoe Conkling's man, put on the ticket in 1880 as a payoff to a faction, a man whose highest office had been collector of the port of New York, from which he had been removed for exactly the kind of political featherbedding everyone practiced and no one confessed. Then, on the 2nd of July, 1881, a delusional office seeker shot President James Garfield in a Washington railroad station, and for 80 days the country kept a horrified vigil while doctors probed the wound with unwashed fingers, and on the 19th of September Garfield died, and at 2:15 in the morning at this same house on Lexington Avenue, by gaslight, in his own parlour, a New York judge administered the oath, and the machine's man was President of the United States. Men wept when they heard, and not with joy. And then Arthur astonished them. He cut the machine dead. He signed, on the 16th of January 1883, the Pendleton Act, the law that began killing the spoil system that had created him, and he signed it knowing precisely what it cost him, which was every friend he had. Conkling's circle called him traitor. The reformers never fully trusted him. He became a president respected by strangers and abandoned by his own tribe, and he bore it with a shrug and excellent tailoring. What nobody outside a tiny circle knew was that he was doing all of it while dying. Within about a year of taking office, his physicians found the disease, Bright's disease, the 19th century's name for a fatal inflammation of the kidneys, a slow poisoning of the blood by the body's own filters. No cure existed. The prognosis was measured in a handful of years, and the disease came with crushing fatigue, nausea, foul mornings, swollen tissue, and spells of black depression, all of which he hid behind the whiskers and the courtesy and a formidable social calendar. He was a widower. His beloved Nell had died of pneumonia in January 1880, before any of it, and he kept fresh flowers before her photograph and told no one his nights were bad. In 1883, the story leaked anyway. A newspaper printed that the president was dangerously ill with Bright's disease, and the White House did what the White House on this list always does. It denied everything. The report was dismissed, the president's health declared excellent, the rumour attributed to malice, and the press moved on, and the country believed the denial, because the alternative, a second dying president in 3 years, was unthinkable. Watch what the secret then made him do, because this is the quiet, aching centre of number 6. The election of 1884 approached. A healthy Chester Arthur would have fought for nomination in his own right, and contemporaries said a nomination was plausibly his to fight for. Instead, he let it go. He made only the faintest, most formal gestures toward the contest, so faint that his allies were bewildered, and his party read it as indifference or weakness, and the nomination went to James Blaine, and the presidency went to Grover Cleveland, about whom you will hear a great deal more before this night is over. Arthur never explained. He could not explain, because the explanation was the secret. He knew a second term was a death sentence he might not outlive, and he refused to ask the country to elect a corpse, and he also refused to tell the country why, and so he accepted, in silence, the reputation of a man too lazy to want the job. History would not learn the truth of that renunciation until after he was gone. It stands, once you know it, as one of the most honourable acts of concealment in American history, a lie of omission committed as a kind of courtesy to the Republic. He left office in March 1885 to a valedictory shrug from the nation, came home to Lexington Avenue, and began to die in earnest of the thing that officially did not exist. Through 1886 the disease took his strength, his heart began to fail with it, and the grey afternoons closed in. And here is a small, strange mercy the record preserves. During those first bewildering months of his accidental presidency, when the whole country doubted him, He'd received a series of remarkable private letters from a young invalid woman in Brooklyn named Julia Sand, a stranger who wrote to him again and again, urging him to be better than his history, to surprise everyone, to reform, and he kept her letters. And once, unannounced, he took his carriage to Brooklyn and called on her, the astonished household serving him in the parlour. Her letters, nearly 24 of them, are among the papers that escape the barrels. They survive in the Library of Congress. The conscience letters made it out of the fire. Almost nothing else did. On the 16th of November, 1886, he gave the order, and the barrels were filled, and the manservant turned the burning pages with an iron rod. On the morning of the 17th, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and on the 18th of November, 1886, at about 5 in the morning, he died in the house where he had taken the oath by gaslight 5 years before. He was 57. The funeral was correct and well attended, and the obituaries were kind in the mild way reserved for men who have stopped mattering. And only afterward, as physicians and intimates spoke and the pieces were assembled, did the country learn that it had had a dying man in the office for years, that the denial of 1883 had been false, that the strange passivity of 1884 had been a deliberate, secret renunciation. By then, the paper trail that might have told the whole story in his own words was ash over a fence on Lexington Avenue. His grave is in Albany, under a bronze angel of sorrow. What he knew for 4 years, the country was told in none of them. He knew. He told the fire kept it. Number 5. You are a copy runner in the wire room of the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles in the second week of July 1960, during the Democratic National Convention, and the teletype machines never stop. Your job is tearing finished stories off the printers and running them to the desks hour after hour, in a haze of cigarette smoke and burned coffee and the machine gun clatter of keys. And sometime in those days before the balloting, a story comes across that makes the men at the desks go quiet and then start talking all at once. People from the Lyndon Johnson campaign, among them a party co-chair named India Edwards, have stood up in front of reporters and said out loud the thing that has been whispered in this hotel for a week. That Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, the young front-runner, the tanned one, the vigorous one, has Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands, and that he lives only because of cortisone. She says, in words that go straight onto the wire, that without it he would not be alive. And then, almost before your next armful of copy, comes the counterfire. The Kennedy campaign denies it, flatly, totally, in a fusillade of statements. The candidate does not have Addison's disease, the charge is malicious, the accusers are desperate, and there is a doctor's statement. Physicians of impeccable standing declaring the senator's health is excellent, fully fit for any duty. You run the denial to the desks. The denial wins. It wins the news cycle. It wins the week. Kennedy wins the nomination in that same building, and in November he wins the presidency by 112,000 votes out of 68 million. One of the narrowest margins in American history, a margin thinner than almost any single revelation might have moved. You are 19 years old, and you have just carried in your own hands both halves of one of the most successful medical deceptions ever practiced on the American electorate. The accusation was true, every word of it. Here is what was actually inside the most photographed body in the world, and I can tell you with precision because the files were eventually opened. But start where he started. John Kennedy had been sick his entire life, a boyhood of collapses and mystery fevers and hospital stays that his family wrapped in jokes. In September 1947, at the age of 30, a congressman touring Europe. He fell gravely ill in London, and a physician there made the diagnosis: Addison's disease, adrenal insufficiency, at that time a condition with a grim expectation. There is a story told years later by a member of that London circle that the doctor privately gave him a year to live. That quotation is a recollection, not a record, so take it as such. What is a record is this. Coming home across the Atlantic that October, he was so ill that he was given the last rites of the Catholic Church aboard ship. He would receive last rites again in 1951 after a collapse in Asia, and again in 1954 when surgeons fused his crumbling lower spine with a metal plate, and the wound would not heal, and death sat by the bed for weeks. 3 times anointed for dying before he ever announced for president. The public was told none of it, and better than none of it. The public was told the opposite. The word they built him out of was vigour. Touch football at Hyannisport sailing, the hatless brown hair in the wind, the war hero swimmer PT 109, whose famous back injury was attributed manfully to the collision with a Japanese destroyer rather than to a spine that had been failing since Harvard. The Addison's diagnosis was guarded like a state secret precisely because it was disqualifying in the public mind. A wasting disease, treated with steroids, in an age when the word cortisone still sounded experimental. The family arranged supplies of his medications in safe deposit boxes and with trusted people around the country so that he could never be caught needing them, a detail later documented from the medical records themselves. And when the direct question finally came, in July 1960, the answer was engineered with a lawyer's scalpel. The doctor's statement declared that he did not have the classic Addison's disease of the textbooks, meaning the tuberculosis-caused variety, and that his adrenal insufficiency, unnamed, was mild and managed. Technically passed, the sentence had a defensible reading. As communication to the voting public, it was a denial of the plain truth, and it was understood by its authors to function as one. The country heard, "He is healthy." The files said otherwise. The files. In the autumn of 2002, 39 years after Dallas, a committee overseeing the Kennedy medical records at his presidential library allowed the historian Robert Dallek, accompanied by a physician, to examine the collection, and what emerged, published in 2002 and 2003, replaced the myth with a chart. The President of the United States, through his 1,000 days, was medicated on a scale no one outside the inner circle had imagined. Daily corticosteroids for the Addisons, thyroid hormone for a failing thyroid, codeine, methadone, or procaine at various times for the back, which was so ruinous that he could not put on his own left shoe on bad days, and a rocking chair entered the Oval Office because sitting still in a normal chair could be an ordeal. Antispasmodics for a lifelong ravaged digestion, antihistamines, sleeping agents, at times anti-anxiety medication, sometimes 10 or more prescriptions running at once, adjusted week to week, all of it charted by his physicians while the television showed the touch football. And alongside the official doctors there was, for a stretch of 1961 and 1962, the other one, Max Jacobson, the New York Society physician the entourage called Dr. Feelgood, whose injections were laced with amphetamines, and who was flown quietly to meet the president, including, the records and later accounts establish, in the period of the Vienna summit with Khrushchev in June 1961, until the White House physicians rebelled and forced him out. When an aide worried aloud about what was in those syringes, Kennedy's documented answer was that he did not care if it was horse piss, it worked. Hold both truths at once, because both are true, and the pairing is the whole point of number 5. The concealment was real, calculated, and electorally decisive in a race that close, and the concealed man performed the office. The record of the missile crisis of October 1962, 13 days at the cliff edge of nuclear war, shows a president composed, patient, skeptical of his generals, in adequate command of himself while medicated exactly as the charts describe. His doctors later concluded the drugs did not visibly impair his judgment in crisis. You may decide the deception was therefore harmless, or you may decide the country had an absolute right to know that its finger on the button belonged to a man on that regimen and was denied the knowledge. What you may not decide anymore is that it did not happen. It happened, dose by dose, in the doctor's own handwriting. He was murdered in Dallas on the 22nd of November 1963 at the age of 46, and the autopsy itself became part of the secret, for the pathologist noted the telltale state of the adrenal glands, essentially destroyed, and that finding was kept from the public record for decades, guarding the fiction even in death. The family sealed the medical files. Doctors who knew held their tongues, honourably or otherwise, into old age. Not until that autumn of 2002 did the country finally meet the actual body of the man it had elected. The broken spine, the dead glands, the pharmacy, the 3 anointings, and by then everyone who could have been voted out over it was beyond all elections. He had told a friend once, in the documented offhand way he preferred for true things, that the doctors had promised his ailments would shorten his life, and that this was one reason he was in a hurry. The hurry, at least, the whole world saw. The reason went to Arlington with him, under the flame that does not go out, and slept there for 39 years. Number 4. You're a hospital corpsman at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, on the afternoon of the 28th of March, 1944, and you've been ordered to forget everything you are about to see. The examining room has been cleared and cleaned twice. The corridor outside has men in it who are not doctors. And at a few minutes past the appointed hour, the doors open and the commander-in-chief of a nation fighting a 2-ocean war is brought in, and your first thought, which you will confess to no one for 30 years, is a single, disloyal, involuntary word: dying. You have seen the face 10,000 times, on newsreels, on posters, in the paper your father reads, the tilted cigarette holder, the upflung chin, the grin like the prow of a ship. The man in front of you is grey-blue at the lips and under the eyes, 62 years old and slumped, breathing shallow and quick with the effort of having been moved, hands with a fine tremor, and when he coughs, which is often, the cough does nothing, and he sags. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been president for 11 years. He looks, on this table, like a man at the far end of something. The physician who examines him is not the famous one, not Admiral McIntyre, the ear, nose and throat man who has supervised the presidential health for a decade and pronounces it splendid at regular intervals. This is a young Navy cardiologist, 34 years old, Lieutenant Commander Howard Bruin, and you watch him work, quiet, thorough, unhurried, blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, fluoroscope, and you watch what happens behind his eyes, because clinicians that age cannot yet fully hide it. What he is finding, the record now shows, is this: grossly elevated blood pressure, an enlarged heart, a failing left ventricle, fluid in the lungs, acute congestive heart failure, in a war president who's been told and has told the country that he has had bronchitis and a stubborn case of the flu. Bruin will write it all down with a cardiologist's severity, and his findings go up the chain to McIntyre, and then occurs one of the most consequential silences in American history. The patient is not told. Roosevelt, by Bruin's own later account, published in a medical journal in 1970, asked not one question about the findings, not one, then or in the year that followed. Doctor and patient entered a wordless treaty, digitalis, rest, a reduced schedule, fewer cigarettes, and no discussion whatsoever of what was being treated, and the press was told the checkup was satisfactory, and McIntyre told reporters the president's health was robust for a man his age, and the war went on. Now understand that this silence had a flaw under it, a foundation of practiced concealment 2 decades deep, because the health of Franklin Roosevelt had been a managed fiction since before most Americans could vote. In August 1921, at his summer place at Campobello, at 39, he was struck by polio, and from that month to his last one he could not walk. I need you to sit with the plainness of that, because the concealment was so successful that his own contemporaries never fully absorbed it. He could not walk. He could not stand unaided. What the public saw for 20 years was an illusion built with engineering and etiquette. 14 pounds of steel braces locked at the knees under the trousers. The strong arm of a son or an aide gripped at the elbow, the other hand white-knuckled on a cane, the hips swinging the dead legs forward in a lurching, laborious imitation of a stroll, 10 yards of which left him soaked in sweat. Podiums built heavy and bolted down so he could hang on them. Ramps installed at back entrances everywhere he went, and the Secret Service scouting buildings like a theatre company's advance crew. And the press, by a gentleman's understanding that seems almost fantastical now, simply did not photograph the truth. Cameramen who tried had their view politely blocked. Out of the tens of thousands of photographs of Franklin Roosevelt in the archives, the ones showing him seated in his wheelchair can be counted on one hand. Newsreels never showed the carrying, the lifting in and out of cars, the strong-backed valet. Once, at the 1936 convention in Philadelphia, the illusion failed in front of thousands. The braces buckled, the president went down, the pages of his speech scattering, and he was hauled upright by aides, hissing at them to clean him up, and delivered the speech, and not a word of the fall appeared anywhere. The historian who studied this deepest called it the splendid deception, and the phrase is exact. It was splendid. It was also a deception, rehearsed daily for 24 years. So when the heart began to fail in 1944, the machinery for hiding it already existed, oiled and staffed, and here the story darkens past the point of gallantry, because 1944 was an election year, and the man Bruin examined in March stood for a 4th term in November. The public campaign was a performance of vitality, including an open car ride through hours of cold New York rain to disprove the health rumours, a stunt that terrified his doctors. The voters chose him over Thomas Dewey without ever being told their president had heart failure, with a running mate, Harry Truman, chosen by party men, some of whom privately understood they were very likely selecting the next president. In February 1945, the dying man sailed and flew to Yalta, and in the photographs from that conference, seated between Churchill and Stalin, the cape around his shoulders, the face is a skull with famous eyes, and the world remarked on it uneasily, and the bulletin said fatigue. Whether his illness bent the diplomacy at Yalta is argued to this day, and I will not pretend the question is settled. What is settled is that no one who voted in November was given the information the March fluoroscope had given a handful of men sworn to silence. And within the great concealment, all along, there had been a second, tender one, and the two secrets chose the same afternoon to surface. Her name was Lucy Mercer. In 1914, she had been Eleanor Roosevelt's own social secretary, young and lovely, and by 1917 Franklin and Lucy were in love. And in 1918 Eleanor found the letters in his luggage, and the marriage nearly ended, and survived only on terms, his mother's money and his political future requiring it, and one of the terms was absolute. He would never see Lucy Mercer again. He promised. She married a wealthy older widower named Rutherford. Decades passed, and the record now shows that the promise was broken, quietly and repeatedly, that as widowed Lucy and aging Franklin drifted back into contact there were discreet visits and drives, and that in the final years the president's own daughter Anna, moved by pity for her father's isolation, helped arrange Lucy's presence at private dinners when Eleanor was away, keeping her mother's ignorance intact, a kindness and a betrayal fused into a single act. Which brings you and all of us to Warm Springs, Georgia, on the 12th of April 1945. The President is resting at the little White House, the modest pine cottage near the polio treatment waters he had loved and funded since the 1920s. It is early afternoon, warm, the smell of pine sap and wood smoke. He sits by the fireplace in a leather chair, signing papers, and across the room a painter named Elizabeth Shumatoff works at his portrait, the one that will be known forever as the unfinished portrait. And sitting quietly nearby, watching the man she had loved across 27 years, is Lucy Mercer Rutherford. At about 1:15 the President raises a hand toward his temple and says, in the words the witnesses preserved, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," and slumps, massive cerebral hemorrhage. Bruin is summoned at a run. The blood pressure readings from that room recorded by the physicians were beyond the instrument's ordinary employment, above 300. He never woke, and at 3:35 that afternoon he died. And then, before the world could be told, the household performed one last drill of the old machinery. Lucy Rutherford and the painter packed and drove away from Warm Spring within the hour, scrubbed from the scene before the announcement went out, so that the first day of the world's grief contained no mention that she had ever been in Georgia at all. Eleanor, arriving that night, having learned by telegram that her husband was dead, learned in that cottage the second fact, that Lucy had been present, and then the third, that her own daughter had known. What passed across her face, an aide who was present wrote later, was something she mastered in silence, and she went in and looked at her husband alone, and came out with her composure fastened like a coat. The country wept for a man it had never actually been allowed to see. The wheelchair, the braces, the failing heart, the woman by the fireplace, all of it was withheld while it mattered and admitted only by increments across the following decades. The heart failure findings published by Bruin in 1970, the full anatomy of the deception assembled by historians. After that, the Lucy story confirmed in memoirs and papers as the participants died. He is buried in his mother's rose garden at Hyde Park, under a plain white marble stone he designed himself, bearing nothing but names and dates. No epitaph. It is fitting past his own intention, the most public man of his century, and the stone declines all further comment, exactly as he always had. Number 3. You're a deckhand on the steam yacht Oneida in the East River of New York on the 1st of July 1893, and you have been told that the President is aboard for a fishing trip, and you know that whatever is happening below decks, it is not fishing. You helped provision this boat. and no fishing party ever provisioned like this. Cases were carried aboard at night from a Manhattan pier, heavy, straw-packed, handled by strangers with soft hands who winced when the crates tilted. The owner's saloon below has been emptied of its furniture except for the organ against the mast, scoured with something sharp-smelling that stings your nose at the companionway, carbolic, a smell you know from hospitals, and a large chair has been lashed upright against the mast in the middle of the cabin, which is not where any sane man puts a chair. 5 or 6 gentlemen came aboard in 2s and 3s after dark last evening, none of them dressed for fish. And this morning, off Bellevue, the biggest man you have ever waited on, Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, 250 pounds of him, came up from the launch, smoked a cigar on deck as if nothing on earth were the matter, and went below. The order to the crew is simple. Steam slow up the river, stay off the saloon skylight, ask nothing. So you polish brass in the sun and steal glances at that skylight, and the yacht slides up the East River at half speed with the tide, past the piers and the coal smoke of the city, gulls crying over the garbage scows, and below your feet in the cabin with the lashed chair, 5 doctors and a dentist are cutting a secret cancer out of the president's mouth. You will not learn this for 24 years. Almost no one will. Here is what the men below decks knew, dated and documented. In May 1893, Cleveland had noticed a rough patch on the roof of his mouth, left side, the cigar side. In June, the sample went quietly to the Army Medical Museum, and the finding came back malignant. It was a bad hour to be a president with cancer, and Cleveland understood the arithmetic instantly, because the arithmetic was the whole reason for the yacht. The country was collapsing into the panic of 1893, one of the worst depressions in its history, banks failing by the hundreds, railroads folding, and Cleveland had staked everything on forcing Congress to repeal the Silver Purchase Act that summer and hold the currency to gold. He'd called a special session for the 7th of August. His vice president, Adlai Stevenson, stood with the silver men. If the markets learned in July that the president was mortally ill, that the silver faction's friend stood a heartbeat from the presidency, Cleveland believed, and his advisers believed the crash would become an avalanche and the repeal would die. Whether they were right can be argued. That they believed it is documented, and so the choice was made. The operation would happen where no reporter could exist, on a friend's yacht, underway, disguised as a holiday. The surgical party his Dr. Joseph Bryant assembled boarded the Oneida, the yacht of his wealthy friend Elias Benedict, by 1s and 2s on the evening of the 30th of June. Among them the famous Philadelphia surgeon William Williams Keene, and a dentist, Ferdinand Hasbrouck, because the plan lived or died on a dental idea. The entire operation would be done inside the mouth, no external incision, no scar for a newspaper man to see. On the morning of the 1st of July, in that saloon, with the president strapped upright in the chair against the mast because the anaesthesia was judged too dangerous to give a heavy man of 56 lying flat, first nitrous oxide, then ether, they took out the tumour and with it most of the upper left jaw, 5 teeth and a portion of the palate, working by the light of the skylight and a portable bulb, in about 90 minutes, while the yacht steamed gently and every rock of the hull passed up through the instruments. If the sea had risen, if the ether had faltered in a man with a thick neck and a labouring heart, the United States would have learned it had lost a president on a pleasure cruise with no explanation on earth available. Nothing failed. The wound was packed. The president was put to bed. And by the 5th of July, when the Oneida stood into Buzzard's Bay at his summer home, Grey Gables, Grover Cleveland walked ashore from his fishing trip under his own power, jaw-packed, mouth-ruined, upright. Then the second half of the operation began, the political half, and it was executed with the same cold competence. A second, smaller procedure on the 17th of July cleaned the margins. In New York, the dentist Casson Gibson built a prosthesis of vulcanized rubber, a plug shaped to fill the missing jaw and palate, and when it was seated, the great sagging gap in the president's face filled out, and almost miraculously the familiar voice came back. Visitors noticed nothing. On the 29th of August, Cleveland's message went before the special session, and that autumn the repeal passed, and the gold standard held, which was the entire point of the ruse. But in between, the secret had actually broken, and this is the part of number 3 that should keep you up, except that tonight nothing is allowed to keep you up. A Philadelphia reporter named E.J. Edwards was given the truth by an indiscreet doctor, verified it properly, and on the 29th of August, 1893, published it, accurately, nearly whole. The operation, the cancer, the yacht, and the White House machine simply rolled over him. Cleveland's friends and physicians denied everything on their honor, allowed as how a bad tooth had been extracted at sea, no more, and mocked the story as fantasy, and it worked. Rival papers ridiculed Edwards. The public, offered a choice between an honest reporter and an honest-looking president, chose the president. Edwards carried the stain of a fabulist for the rest of his career. That is the completeness of burial this list ranks by. The truth was printed in a major newspaper, and the concealment beat it anyway. The vindication took 24 years and required nearly everyone to die first. Cleveland served out his term, lived on to 1908, and died at Princeton on the 24th of June of that year, officially of heart failure, having never publicly said the word cancer. And in 1917, old Dr. Keene, the last eminent survivor of the saloon, published the full confession in a national magazine. The strapped chair, the ether, the jaw, the rubber plug, and paused, in print, to state plainly that Mr. Edwards had been right in every essential, and had deserved none of what was done to his name. The tumour itself, by the way, still exists. The surgeons kept it, and it sits today in a glass case in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. And in 1980, pathologists re-examined the specimen and gave it a modern name, verrucous carcinoma, a slow, stubborn, rarely spreading cancer, which is why the man survived it. You can stand in front of that jar on any quiet afternoon. It is the only secret on this list you can visit, and the deckhand, polishing brass above the skylight while it happened. He watched the gentleman fish, listlessly and badly, for the benefit of any telescope ashore, and he held his questions, and the summer passed, and the yacht smelled of carbolic below decks for weeks. 24 years later, if he lived, he opened a magazine and finally learned what he had been steaming slowly up the East River with. The Republic's finances balanced that summer, you could argue, on a lash chair, a rubber jaw, and the discipline of a crew that knew how to see nothing. The president went fishing, the story said. The story held for a generation. The jar in Philadelphia holds forever. Number 2. You're a junior usher on the second floor of the White House on the morning of the 2nd of October 1919, and the corridor rule has just changed, and no one has explained the new rule, which is the surest sign in any great house that something terrible has happened. Since dawn, the private end of the floor has been sealed. You stand your post by the elevator with your gloves and your silence, and you count what passes. Mrs. Wilson, grey-faced, moving fast without seeming to run, a skill great ladies have. Dr. Grayson, the president's physician, the handsome Navy man, taking the stairs 2 at a time, and Dr. Grayson does not take stairs 2 at a time. Then other doctors, 3, 4, summoned by telephone, shown up quietly. A wheeled chair, screens, and from behind the closed door of the president's suite, no sound at all, which is somehow worse than any sound could be. The chief usher, Mr. Hoover, who has run this floor for decades and has a face like a locked drawer, comes past your post at mid-morning, and you risk it. One question: is the president ill? And he looks at you for a moment and says, "Arrange some rest for yourself. It is going to be a long time." That is all he says. He is more right than either of you can imagine. What happened behind that door this morning you will learn only in pieces across the rest of your life. Woodrow Wilson was found on the floor of his bathroom. A massive stroke has paralyzed his left side. The President of the United States has, in the space of one October morning, effectively ceased to function. And the country will not be told for 17 months. And even then it will not really be told. Wind it back 1 week, because the road to that bathroom floor is documented mile by mile. In September 1919, Wilson went west to save his treaty. The Senate stood against the Versailles Settlement and its League of Nations, the great covenant he believed, with the full grandeur of a Presbyterian conscience, would abolish the kind of war that had just consumed the world. So he went over the Senate's head to the people, 8,000 miles of railroad in 3 weeks, some 40 speeches from prairie platforms and civic auditoriums in September heat. A 62-year-old man with a long history of vascular trouble that his doctors knew intimately and the public knew not at all. The headaches came and grew and split. He could not sleep, could barely eat, and Grayson watched the blood pressure and begged him to stop. On the 25th of September, at Pueblo, Colorado, he gave the last speech of his life, weeping openly at his own peroration about the war dead, the crowd weeping with him. That night, westbound out of Pueblo, he broke, the face sagging, the words stumbling, a night of agony in the private car, and Grayson cancelled the tour, and the train ran east to Washington, with the shades of the presidential car drawn, through stations where crowds had gathered to see a president who could not be shown. 1 week later came the bathroom floor, the 2nd of October, the thrombosis, the paralyzed left side, the dimmed left field of vision. The most powerful man on earth was felled in his own washroom, and his wife and his doctor knelt over him, and then they stood up and made the decision this list ranks second among all the secrets of the presidency. They told no one, not the cabinet, not the vice president. I need you to understand that with complete plainness, because there has never been anything like it before or since in American history, Vice President Thomas Marshall was never officially informed that the president had suffered a stroke, never summoned, never briefed, left to learn what he could from rumour, and, by one account, from a journalist, and he was so horrified by the constitutional abyss, and so wary of seeming a usurper, that he refused to move an inch toward the powers of the office. The cabinet got Grayson's bulletins, and the bulletins were masterpieces of the useless truth. Nervous exhaustion, needs rest, condition improving. The word stroke appears in none of them. The country was told its president was worn out from fighting for peace, resting under doctor's orders, and would soon be himself. Meanwhile, the man behind the sealed door could not sit up unassisted for weeks. and the business of the executive branch of the United States government arrived each day in pouches and stopped at a bedroom door in the hands of a woman with no office, no election, and no oath. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, his second wife, married to him barely 4 years, a Virginia widow of commanding presence and total loyalty. From October 1919 into 1921, every paper, every bill, every appointment, every crisis that sought the President of the United States passed through her hands first, or did not pass at all. She decided what he saw, when, and in what form, in consultation with Grayson, and with the fierce arithmetic of a wife who had been told, or believed, that removing the burdens was the only way to keep him alive, and that resigning would kill him faster than the stroke. Years later, in her memoir, she gave her own account of those months and named it as she saw it, her stewardship, and insisted in a sentence historians have been arguing with ever since, that she herself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs, only decisions about what was important enough to bring to her husband, take her claim as her claim, then set beside it the documented condition of the man, the paralysis, the exhaustion, the flickering attention of a gravely damaged brain, and ask yourself where, in such a sick room, the boundary between selecting a president's business and doing a president's business could possibly have lain. Some historians have called her, without much exaggeration, the first woman to run the executive branch. Whatever name you give it, it was government by concealment, and it ran for the better part of a year and a half, and the Republic, headless, wobbled. In those 17 months, the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, quietly convened the cabinet on his own authority more than 20 times to keep the machinery turning, and when Wilson finally learned of it, the sick man's response in February 1920 was to demand and receive Lansing's resignation for the crime of holding meetings. Bills became law unsigned because no signature could be had in time. A crippling wave of strikes, the violent Red Scare raids, the post-war economy seizing up, all of it broke over an executive branch whose executive was a rumour. Foreign ambassadors could not present credentials for months. And the treaty he had broken himself to save, came to its Senate votes in November 1919 and again in March 1920, and a compromise on the League might have passed. Senators stood ready to cross over on modest reservations, and from the sealed sick room came word, in messages whose very authorship remains uncertain, that loyal Democrats must accept no compromise at all. So the treaty failed twice, and the United States never joined the League of Nations that its own president had invented, in part because the man who might have bent, the healthy Wilson, the supple politician of 1913, no longer existed, and the person occupying his name was an invalid guarded by a wife and a doctor, certain, with the terrible certainty of the brain injured, that the people were with him. Historians of medicine have written carefully about that certainty, the rigidity, the paranoia at the edges. His stroke did not merely remove a president, it replaced him with a harder, narrower one, and nobody outside the door was permitted to measure the difference. They ran one performance for the doubters, and it deserves its place in the story. By December 1919, the whispers in the Senate had grown dangerous, and a delegation of 2 senators, one of them Wilson's open enemy Albert Fall, was permitted at last into the bedroom. A staged audience, the president propped and arranged, his dead left arm concealed beneath the covers, the room's lighting managed, papers placed about to suggest work. Fall, searching the wreckage for the man, said he had been praying for the president. And the famous reply, which comes to us from the recollections of those present, so hold it as recounted rather than transcribed, was, "Which way, Senator?" The delegation emerged and told the press the president was sharp and in command. The mind, in fairness, could still flash like that in 10-minute windows. What the senators were not shown was everything else, and the show worked, and the impeachment talk and the disability talk died away, and the stewardship ran on undisturbed. He survived after his fashion. In March 1921 he left office, rode down Pennsylvania Avenue beside the huge new President Harding, whom you have already met tonight at number 7, and retired to a house on S Street in Washington, an invalid at 64, and there he lived out 3 shadowed years, watching motion pictures in his library, weeping sometimes without warning, as the stroke-damaged do, receiving the faithful on Armistice Day from his doorstep. He died in that house on the 3rd of February 1924 with Edith beside him, and his last recorded word was her name, and still the secret held its shape. Grayson kept the medical files private for the rest of his life, and the full clinical truth of October 1919, the arterial history running back decades, the strokes before the stroke, the true condition month by month, was not laid bare until historians and physicians got Grayson's papers and the complete record in the closing decades of the 20th century, 60 years and more after the bathroom floor. Out of the whole affair eventually came a law. When the framers of the 25th Amendment sat down in the 1960s to write the rules for presidential disability, the ghost at that table, cited in their debates, was Woodrow Wilson, the 17 months when the United States had a president no one was allowed to see. Edith lived until 1961, to the age of 89, guarding the story to the end, and she rode 2 months before her death in the inaugural procession of John F. Kennedy, whose own secret you've already heard, one concealment saluting another across the crowd, neither knowing what the other carried. The country never voted on any of it. The country was never asked. That was the point. Number 1. You're a hired joiner's apprentice at Monticello on the mountaintop above Charlottesville, Virginia, in the second week of September, 1802, and the newspaper has come up the mountain. You're 17, indentured to the joinery for the fine interior work, and you were sent to the house this morning to measure a window architrave, which is how you come to be standing in the entrance hall, invisible in the way workmen are invisible when one of the White household men brings in the post, Richmond papers among it. And you know something is in them, because the house has been strange for days, the way a house is strange when the people in it are all not talking about the same thing. On the 1st of September, the Richmond Recorder printed a paragraph by a journalist named James Thompson Callender, a drunkard, a blackmailer, a wrecker of reputations, and, as time would prove, on this occasion, in his central claim, correct. It is well known, the paragraph began, that the man whom it delighteth the people to honour keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. The man it delighteth the people to honour is the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, author of the sentence that all men are created equal, and he is upstairs in this house, and the woman the newspaper means is in this house too, or in its dependencies, a seamstress and chambermaid of about 29 years, and you have seen her. Everyone on this mountain has seen her. Sally Hemings, called light-skinned in every account that survives. decorous, quiet, and you have heard the older workmen say, in lowered voices, what the newspaper has now printed for the whole republic, and you have also heard what the newspaper does not print, the thing that makes the whole arrangement dizzying, which is that Sally Hemings is the half-sister of the president's dead wife. Same father, the planter John Wales, by an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings, the late Martha Jefferson's own blood, held as property in her widower's house. And here is what you witness in September 1802, standing with your rule and pencil in the hall of the most famous private house in America. Nothing. That is the whole testimony, and it is the darkest exhibit on this list. No denial is drafted. No friend is authorized to refute. No word is spoken at dinner, where the talk, a guest of those years recorded, ran to merino sheep and the weather and the improvement of ploughs. The president goes on with his letters, his instruments, his garden book, in which he will note frosts and peas for another 24 years, and about the paragraph in the recorder he says nothing, and about Sally Hemings he will say nothing, in public, or, so far as any surviving paper shows, in private, for the rest of his life, not to defend himself, not to deny, not to confess, a silence so total, maintained so perfectly across a quarter-century of ferocious public curiosity, that it must be understood as a policy, the settled strategy of the most disciplined pen in America. Every other man on this list hid a secret behind a lie. Jefferson hid his behind a void. Now let me give you the documented shape of what the void contained, dated, and I will mark the one place where the evidence is testimony rather than record. Sally Hemings came to Jefferson's household as an infant of his wife's estate around 1774. In 1787, aged about 14, she crossed the Atlantic as the companion of his younger daughter and joined his household in Paris, where he was minister to France, a widower in his mid-40s who had sworn to his dying wife, the accounts of the family say, never to remarry. In France, by law, Sally could have claimed her freedom. She returned with him to Virginia in 1789 instead. Her son Madison Hemings, in a memoir given to an Ohio newspaper in 1873, said his mother, pregnant at 16 in Paris, extracted from Jefferson a promise, freedom for her children at 21, in exchange for her return, and that account is testimony, one son's record of his mother's life, set down long after, and I give it to you as exactly that. What is record is this. Sally Hemings bore 6 children between 1795 and 1808, 4 of whom lived, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, Eston. Their births are entered in Jefferson's own farm book, in his own hand, among the plantation's enumerations, and this, which took a computer age to notice properly. Jefferson, who travelled constantly, was present at Monticello at the right interval, before every single one of those births, 9 months, every conception window without exception, across 13 years, and this, no other man's presence matches the pattern, and the children were so light that several would live their adult lives as white. And visitors remarked, in writing, on the resemblance of certain household servants to the master of the house. One overseer, Edmund Bacon, recalled seeing another man leave Sally's room, a recollection recorded decades later, second-hand, and contradicted by the whole pattern of the evidence, and I report it because I said I would tell you when a claim was a claim on any side of the question. And the ending Jefferson wrote tells its own story, in actions where he permitted no words. Beverly Hemings and his sister Harriet, in 1822, in their early 20s, were simply allowed to walk away, unpursued, no advertisements, no slave catchers, Harriet given money and put on the stagecoach north by the overseer, on instruction, both of them vanishing into white America. Runaways, the plantation's ledger implied. Manumissions in all but ink, said everyone who could count. Then the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day from the Declaration, Jefferson died at Monticello, an old man of 83 drowning in debt, and his will freed 5 men, 5, out of the roughly 200 human beings he owned at the end, and among the 5 were Madison and Eston Hemmings, the 2 remaining sons of Sally. Sally Hemings herself he did not free, not in life, not in the will, sparing the estate, historians note, the public formality that would have named her, and it was his daughter Martha who afterward quietly gave Sally her time, an informal liberty, and Sally lived out her last years in Charlottesville with her sons and died in 1835, owning an inventory records, some furniture, and mementos of the man, and never having said one recorded public word about any of it, her silence enclosing his, in January 1827, on the west lawn of the house you helped finish. The estate auctioned 130 of the others, the Fawcetts and Hearns and Gillettes, families broken southward under the hammer to pay the dead philosopher's debts, while the beautiful house stood emptied above them. That auction is documented to the day, and no account of number 1 is honest without it, because it is the flaw under the whole story. The secret was not an affair. The secret was that the man who wrote the creed of human equality kept his own children and their mother and 200 other people as property, and arranged even his mercies so that they would tell no tales. The family denial machine ran for 170 years after his death, attributing the Hemings children to nephews, dismissing Madison Hemings' memoir as folklore, and respectable scholarship largely went along. And then science, which has no politeness, arrived at last on the mountain. In 1998, a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster collected blood from living male line descendants, of Eston Hemings on one side and of Jefferson's paternal line on the other, and on the 5th of November 1998, the journal Nature published the result. The Y chromosome carried by Eston Hemings' descendants was the Jefferson family chromosome, a rare signature, and the nephews of the old alibi did not carry the explanation the deniers needed. Combined with the conception window evidence and the weight of the documents, the foundation that owns Monticello concluded, in a report issued in January 2000, that Thomas Jefferson was almost certainly the father of Eston, and most probably of all of Sally Hemings' children, and that is where the honest record stands today, a very high probability, short of the absolute only, because absolutes are not what centuries leave behind. 172 years from the void of 1802 in that entrance hall to the laboratory printout, the longest kept secret on this list, and the darkest, because every other secret tonight was carried by the man who made it. This one was carried in enforced silence by the people it was done to, generation after generation, the Hemings family repeating their true ancestry at kitchen tables for 2 centuries while the world called it legend, until the blood of the living confirmed the testimony of the dead. On his obelisk at Monticello, Jefferson ordered 3 achievements carved: the Declaration, the Statute of Religious Freedom, the University, and not a word more, because he wrote, by these testimonials he most wished to be remembered. He controlled even his stone. He could not, in the end, control the chromosome. The mountain kept his silence for as long as silence can be kept, which turns out to be 172 years and not 1 year longer. And that is the bottom of the list. 10 rooms, and we have stood quietly in all of them. Come back up now, slowly, the way a diver comes up, because the rest of tonight belongs to the surface, and to you. Notice first what you have actually been listening to, because it is not what the title promised, or not only that. The title promised darkness, and there was darkness, a cancer in a jar, a paralysed man behind a bulletin, children in a farm book. But walk back through the 10 rooms in your mind, drowsily, without effort, and notice who was actually in them. Not really the presidents. The presidents were mostly asleep, or dying, or gone. The rooms were full of the other people. The technician with his tool bag and his eyes forward in the corridor. The groom at the garden fence in the winter rain. The clerk carrying broth up the stairs of a dry goods store, the maid feeding a widow's fire, the manservant with the iron rod in the copper light, the copy runner with both halves of a lie in his 2 hands, the corpsman ordered to forget a grey face, the deckhand polish and brass over a skylight, the usher counting doctors past his post, the apprentice with his rule and pencil, invisible in the hall. Secrets of state, it turns out, are kept the way everything in a great house is kept, by the staff. History remembered the men in the beds. The rooms were held together by the people standing at the edges of them, seeing everything, saying nothing, which is, if you think about it, exactly what you've been doing tonight. You have been the 11th witness, standing in 10 doorways, and nobody asked you a single question, and now your shift is ending. And notice the pattern that ran under all 10, quiet as a water pipe in a wall. Not one of these men hid a thing because hiding was pleasant. Every concealment on this list was built out of the same conviction, held sometimes nobly, sometimes selfishly, usually both at once, that the truth would break something enormous. Cleveland believed the truth would break the currency of the United States, so he had his jaw taken out on a moving yacht rather than say the word cancer in July. Edith Wilson believed the truth would kill her husband and orphan his treaty, so she became a government of 1 to bedroom door. Arthur believed the truth would make him a lame duck and a public death watch, so he handed the fire his archive and the country his reputation for laziness, which was cheaper. Johnson believed candour would freeze every honest voice on his telephone, so the machine stayed secret even from the friends it was recording, and the truth was assigned a date safely past every funeral. The Kennedys believed the truth would lose an election by a margin smaller than a rounding error, and they were almost certainly right. Roosevelt believed, and his whole era half believed with him, that a nation in depression and war could not be asked to follow a man it had seen carried. Jefferson believed, or needed to believe, that the void could hold. Each of them looked at the Republic and decided it could not bear the weight of one particular fact, and then carried that fact alone instead. Whether they were protecting the country or protecting themselves is a question with a different answer in every room, and some rooms have both answers at once, and that ambiguity, more than any scandal, is the true darkness the title promised. Power lies, yes, everyone knows that. What is stranger and sadder and much more human is that power lies most desperately about being mortal. Because run the list again and count the categories. Set the listening machine aside, since a machine was the one exception, and count the rest. A mind, a kidney, a gland, a jaw, a heart, a brain, a marriage, and more than once, a bed. Nearly every secret on this list, in whole or in part, was a body. The most powerful office on earth, and the thing its occupants could least afford to confess was the one thing they had in common with every farmhand and chambermaid in the country, that the machinery wears out, that the chest aches, that the night thoughts come. The presidency demanded gods, so mortal men built gods out of bulletins and rubber and steel braces and denial, and climbed inside and waved. And the strangest part, the part worth carrying into sleep, is that the country mostly knew better and voted for the god anyway. The reporters saw Roosevelt lifted like cargo and wrote about his jaunty grin. The senators watched Wilson's staged bedroom theatre and let themselves be reassured. It was not only a deception practiced on the public, it was, at least a little, a deception the public was glad to have practiced on it, because nations, like children at bedtime, sometimes prefer the story to the fact, and will pay for it, and did. And then, always, the paper. Stay drowsy and think about the paper, because the paper is the real hero of tonight. The patient, silent, load-bearing hero. Every one of these 10 secrets was eventually beaten by an archive. Not by a confession, almost never by a deathbed unburdening, by things. A cardiologist's clinical notes held 26 years published in a medical journal. A doctor's memoir in a magazine in 1917, setting a wronged reporter's name straight while there was still one man alive to do it. A closet in Marion, Ohio, holding 100 love letters through 4 decades of winters. A court seal with a date on it, ticking politely toward July 2014. A farm book where a great man, meticulous to the end, could not stop himself from recording in his own hand the births he would never speak of. A garbage barrel that missed 24 letters from an invalid woman in Brooklyn. A jar of preserved tissue in a Philadelphia museum, waiting 87 years for pathologists with better microscopes. 800 hours of belts and reels in locked boxes in Austin, holding a president's own voice against a deadline he set himself. And finally the blood itself, the archive nobody can burn, walking around inside great-great-grandchildren, holding its one sentence patiently for a century, for 2 centuries, until a laboratory asked it the question. Every fire on this list was set to destroy a record, and every fire missed something, because the world is simply too full of paper, too full of witnesses, too full of descendants. If there is a moral in the whole 10, it is not that the truth always comes out, because some truths, Natchez in 1791, the calls Johnson chose never to record, are gone for good. The moral is smaller and steadier than that. Ash is final, but ash is hard to finish. Something always slips the fire. Provenance outlives precedence. The ledger in the end is longer than the life. Think how long the waiting was, though. Feel the lengths of it, because the lengths themselves are soothing. The way geological time is soothing. 20 years from the last reel boxed in Austin to the first one played aloud. 24 years from the yacht to Keane's confession. 26 from Bruin's fluoroscope to his journal article. 38 from the microphone in Roosevelt's desk lamp to the historian who found the recordings. 39 from Dallas to the opened files. Roughly 70 from the bathroom floor to the full clinical record. 91 from the fires at Friendship to the Library of Congress reading room. 92 from the Palace Hotel to the DNA announcement. 172 from the silence in the entrance hall to the 5th of November, 1998. Secrets on this scale do not break exactly. They ripen. They wait out every person with a reason to care, every career that could be ruined, every heart that could be broken, and then, when the last interested party is safely stone, they surface gently, harmlessly, into the hands of historians like deep-sea things floating up at night. There is a mercy in that lag, if you look at it kindly. By the time the truth arrived, in almost every case, it could no longer hurt anyone. It could only complete the record. Eleanor was gone before the fullest accounts of Warm Springs were assembled. Nan Britton's daughter was 4 years dead when the laboratory finally called her father by his name. The wound and the truth were kept in separate centuries, which is a kind of anesthesia, the same trick Cleveland surgeons used, only performed by time itself. History, it turns out, is the ether of nations. The operation still happens, you just feel it later, and less. Go visit the graves for a moment, since we are winding down, since the mind at this hour likes to travel without moving. It costs nothing now, and they are quiet places, everyone. The family graveyard at Stonewall, Texas, where Lyndon Johnson lies under the live oaks beside the pedernales, the river running low and quiet, an easy drive from the library in Austin, where his own voice, unsealed at last, plays every day for strangers in headphones, the garden at the Hermitage, where Andrew and Rachel lie side by side under the cupola he built her, and the Tennessee cicadas run their long, soft engine all summer over the word slander carved in stone. Springfield, the great tomb at Oak Ridge, where Lincoln lies deep under concrete, placed there in the end after thieves once tried for the coffin, so that even his body needed guarding from the living, and above him the bronze face wears the melancholy openly at last, because sculptors are allowed to say what press secretaries are not. Marion, Ohio, the round white memorial open to the sky. Warren and Florence together, the burned letters and the surviving letters, all equally past mattering to them now. Albany, the bronze angel drooping her wings over Chester Arthur, one of the loneliest and most beautiful graves in America, a monument to a man almost nobody remembers guarding a secret almost nobody knew. Arlington at night, the small steady flame. Hyde Park, the plain white stone in the rose garden, nothing but names and dates, roses breathing in the dark. Princeton, where Cleveland lies under a modest stone among the university dead, 20 minutes' walk from libraries that hold the papers of the men who kept his secret. The National Cathedral in Washington, where Wilson lies in stone sleep inside the only presidential tomb in the Capitol itself. Organ practice murmuring down the nave on weekday afternoons, and the obelisk on the mountainside at Monticello, behind its iron fence, with its 3 chosen achievements and its enormous omission, while somewhere down the slope lies the unmarked ground of the mountain's other dead, the Hemmingses and Fawcett's and Hearns, whose descendants now sit on the foundation boards and give the tours and say the names aloud in the entrance hall where a boy once stood, measuring an architrave in perfect silence. Every secret on this list is now a plaque, a finding aid, an exhibit label, a paragraph read calmly by schoolchildren. That is what time does to the unbearable. It makes it curriculum. And spare one last thought, the softest one, for the witnesses. Because you've been one of them all night and you deserve the truth about them too. I told you at the start that the eyes I lent you were borrowed, composites, stitched from the kinds of people the records barely name, and so I cannot tell you how their stories ended, and I will not invent endings for them now, at the drowsiest hour of the night when you would believe me. Whoever they really were, the stewards and grooms and maids and ushers of those years, history closed over them the way water closes over a dropped coin, quietly, completely, keeping no shape at all. Their fates are the one archive nobody kept. What I can tell you is how the keepers with names ended, because their endings are documented. Dr. Bruen held his silence for 26 years, and then published every reading in 1970 and lived out a long life as an honest footnote. Old Dr. Keene wrote the truth in 1917 and cleared a ruined reporter's name while there was still one man alive to thank him. The Carrie Phillips letters outlived everyone in them and came blinking into the light in 2014. The Hemmings family repeated their testimony at kitchen tables for 2 centuries until the laboratory said it back to them in November 1998. Mildred Stiegel guarded her locked boxes to the letter, and the tapes began to speak in 1993 anyway, and she lived long enough to hear them, and the nameless ones carried what they saw the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, aware of it always, troubled by it rarely, and it went to their graves with them too. And nobody ranks their concealments, and that is the last quiet joke of the whole subject. Everyone on earth is taking secrets to the grave. Presidents merely do it with better archives. Which brings the night at last all the way down to you. You in your own bed in your own house with your own upstairs floor that the public never sees. Because you understand this list better than you think you do. You have your own residence, your own second floor, your own trays that go up the back stairs. Things you carry that the people who love you are not told, not out of wickedness, but out of the same conviction those 10 men had, that the truth is heavy and the house runs better if one person carries it alone. Maybe you're right about that, and maybe, like most of the tin, you're wrong. But either way, hear this one instruction from the whole long night, the only instruction in it. You do not have to carry anything for the next 8 hours. That is the actual mercy of sleep, the constitutional provision written into the body itself. Whatever you are keeping, the office of keeping it is now closed until morning. The papers can sit in their boxes. No fire needs tending. No bulletin is required. There is no one to manage, no version to maintain, no face to arrange. The nightly transfer of power has come, the orderly kind, the kind that has never once failed. From the waking self to the sleeping one, and the sleeping one, you may have noticed, keeps every secret perfectly and judges none of them. So let the 10 rooms close now, one by one, hear the doors, gentle as the doors at the Hermitage that December night. Close the way people close doors when something precious is in the house, because something is. The little machine room off the Oval Office goes dark, the belts at rest under their grey covers. The lamp in the Hermitage breezeway is blown out, and the garden takes the rain alone. The candle above the store in Springfield gutters flares once on the frost ferns and goes. The fire at Friendship falls into its embers, and the embers into their grey. The barrels in the Lexington Avenue yard are cold iron under frost before midnight. The teletypes in the Biltmore wire room are switched off row by row, and the silence in their rings. The corridor at Bethesda empties, and a corpsman walks home past the lit windows of the wards. The Oneida swings at anchor in Buzzards Bay, riding light after her strange cargo, halyards ticking. The second floor of the White House stands hushed, an usher's gloves folded on a chair. And at Monticello the entrance hall holds only moonlight and the slow tick of the great 7-day clock Jefferson built into the wall, which is still running, by the way, wound weekly by museum staff, still telling the days of the week with a cannonball on a rope, the most innocent of all his mechanisms, keeping the only kind of time that ever tells the whole truth. There is one more turn of the lamp worth taking before we put it out, drowsy as you are, because it settles the story like a last log settles a fire. You might be wondering, somewhere behind your closing eyes, whether all of this still happens, whether the residence still keeps its secrets. And the honest answer is that the world the 10 rooms belong to has mostly ended, and it ended for reasons you have already heard tonight without noticing. The gentleman's agreement died with the cameras, because television does not avert its eyes the way the newsreel men did, and no press secretary alive could hide a wheelchair from 100 lenses running live. The medical silence began to die in Denver in 1955, when President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack, and, once the word had finally been said aloud, ordered his doctors to tell the public nearly everything, an avalanche of clinical candor that accidentally invented the modern custom of the Presidential Health Report, so that candidates now release physicians' summaries the way they release tax returns, grudgingly, incompletely, but publicly, a ritual that exists because the old concealments finally cost too much to ensure. The secret taping died loudest of all in 1973, when the inheritance you heard about at number 10 reached Richard Nixon and destroyed him, and the subpoenas taught every later occupant of that office that a hidden microphone is a loaded gun pointed backward. And the constitutional void died in 1967, when the 25th Amendment was ratified, and the Republic at last wrote down what it had learned at Edith Wilson's door, that there must be a procedure, a paper trail, a way for power to pass when the body fails, so that no wife and no doctor would ever again have to govern from a bedroom by instinct and love and terror. Every safeguard is a scar. When you read the amendment's dry clauses, acting president, written declaration, unable to discharge the powers and duties, you are reading the bathroom floor of October 1919, translated into law. That is how countries remember. Not by feeling the wound forever, but by growing the rule where the wound was. And yet do not let that comfort tip into certainty, because the deeper habit, the human one, did not end and will not. The instruments improved, and the incentives remain. There will always be a candidate's ache that does not reach the summary, a diagnosis softened in the telling, a file that waits for a library. The lesson of tonight was never that concealment stopped in 1967. It is that concealment has a half-life, that the room always empties eventually, that the last person out always leaves a door unlocked without meaning to. Somewhere tonight, it is reasonable to assume a secret of state is being kept in the old way, by a small circle with good intentions behind a calm announcement, and somewhere a future historian, possibly not yet born, will one day open the box it left behind and sit back in a reading room chair and whisper, quietly, "There you are." You will not know about it, and neither will I, and there is a strange peace in that, the same peace the deckhand had. Not everything is ours to know on time. Almost everything is someone's to know eventually. One more small history of fires too, since tonight has been so full of them, because the burning was never only a presidential habit, and knowing that softens it somehow. Martha Washington, after the general died in December 1799, burned nearly all the letters she and George had written each other across 40 years of marriage, decades of courtship and war and household news, sparing, whether by oversight or mercy, only a few, and so the private voice of the first marriage in American history is ash in a Mount Vernon hearth, and no historian has ever quite forgiven her, and every married person quietly understands her completely. The founders' wives burned. The Victorians burned. Half the great archives of the world are defined by their scorch marks. When Florence Harding pulled her chair to the fire at Friendship, she was not inventing anything. She was performing the oldest widow's office there is, deciding what the future was entitled to, one page at a time, with the smoke going up the chimney like the past clearing its throat. We call it destroying history. They called it protecting the dead. Both are true, and the argument between those two truths is never going to end, and it does not need to end tonight, and certainly not on your pillow. So let the whole subject fold itself up now, the way a valet folds a coat, seams matched, weight distributed, set on the chair for morning. 10 men, 10 rooms, 10 silences of different shapes, a technician, a groom, a clerk, a maid, a manservant, a runner, a corpsman, a deckhand, an usher, an apprentice, and you, the 11th, the one who stayed for all of it. The belts have stopped turning, the barrels are cold, the wire room is dark, the yacht ride's easy. The clock in the entrance hall pulls its cannonball down another inch toward Thursday. Everything on the list has been carried as far as it can be carried by anyone still awake. And if your mind wants one last thing to hold as it goes under, give it the sounds, because the sounds of tonight were gentler than the facts, and the ear is the last sentry to leave its post. The flat slap of the tide against the Oneida's hull, regular as breathing. The low wax murmur of a dictaphone belt turning in a quiet outer office, patient as a clock, taking down a president's good night. Winter rain on 10,000 hat brims in a Tennessee garden, and under it, faintly, a hymn. The scratch of a steel pen in a cold Springfield room, writing the most miserable man living and then pausing, nib lifted, deciding to go on. The soft concussion of a file box settling into flame, and the small upward rush of sparks like applause from very far away. An iron rod turning paper in a November yard, that dry librarian's whisper of burning pages, the teletype bells of Los Angeles ringing their little urgencies to an empty room, the double click of a blood pressure cuffs valve in Bethesda, and a young cardiologist exhaling through his nose. The knock of oar and gull down the East River, 1893, low water. Felt slippers on the marble of a hushed second floor, a wife's footsteps measuring the distance between her husband and the world. And under all of it, first and last, the Monticello clock, tick and tick and tick, the cannonball descending by inches through a hole in the floor into the cellar, marking off a week that will end, as all of its weeks have ended for 2 centuries, in another Sunday winding, another climb, another slow descent. Every one of those sounds happened. Everyone has stopped. The stopping is what history is, and the strange kindness of listening from this far away is that stopped things cannot startle you. They can only rock you, faint and even, like water a long way from any yacht. You're quiet enough now, heavy enough, safe enough. You have a bed and a door and a morning that will come without any help from you. That is more than most of the people in tonight's story had on their hardest nights. That is enough. It is enough. It is more than enough. Let the list go first. Let the numbers unorder themselves. 10 and 7 and 3, drifting apart like boats from a mooring. Because you do not need to hold the ranking anymore. No one will examine you. The examination is cancelled forever. Let the names go next. The doctors and the widows and the keepers. Grayson and Bruin and Keene. Florence at her fire. Edith at her door. Mildred with her locked boxes. Let them all step back into their portraits and their finding aids, tipping their heads to you, closing their folders. Let the dates go last because you held them so well. 1893 and 1919 and 1944 and 1998. Let them slide off the edge of the bed like a book you are finished with anyway. landing soft on the carpet of some archive where a kind librarian will reshelve them in the morning. Let the whole Republic of the Dead go back to sleep, as it does every night, under its stones and its angels and its eternal flame, requiring nothing further from you. Grateful, if the dead are ever grateful, simply for having been accurately remembered for one evening by one drowsy, decent, unimportant, irreplaceable person. Tomorrow there will be news, and some of it will not be the whole story, and that will be tomorrow's problem. Tomorrow there will be your own trays to carry up your own stairs, your own small fires to tend, your own versions to maintain, and you will maintain them capably, the way the ushers and stewards always have. Tomorrow the archives will open at 9 and the reading rooms will fill, and somewhere a sealed box will come one day closer to its date. But that is tomorrow. All of that is tomorrow. Right now there is only this room, this dark, this familiar weight of blankets, this breath going in and out at its own unhurried pace, the same as the breath of every sleeper in every century of tonight's story, the same as the boy in the attic over the store, the same as the deckhand in his hammock over the tide. Centuries will pass. The house behind the black iron fence will change beyond recognition and be rewired and rebuilt and photographed by machines not yet imagined. The medical bulletins will become data, and the data will be leaked, and the leaks will be argued about by people not yet born. The sealed boxes now waiting in the archives, and there are such boxes waiting right now, with dates on them, will open one by one to astonish generations who think themselves beyond astonishment. But people will still stand at the edges of important rooms, seeing everything, saying nothing, still carry trays up back stairs, still love the wrong person quietly and protect someone by silence, and believe the house runs better if one heart carries the weight alone. Some things do not change. The residence does not change. The upstairs floor of every life stays private, and every window you have ever seen lit at night was lit over some version of it, and that is not a dark thought at all, in the end. It is just the species keeping its rooms. So let it come now. Let sleep take you the way the tide took the Oneida up the East River, slow and level, and sure of the channel, no reporters anywhere on the water. Let the last lit window go dark. Let the house of your mind post its quiet usher at the stair, gloves folded, permitting no further business tonight. Let your thoughts slow and soften, and finally stop like a great clock in an entrance hall, wound again by someone else in the morning, which will arrive on its own as it always has, without a single secret required of you. You were the witness tonight. You saw everything. You said nothing. You did it perfectly. The record is complete. The file is closed. The lamp is out. Good night.